Welcome to the UNSECURITY podcast. Each week, Evan and Brad give an inside look at current information security news, breaches, best practices, and other things you should know to improve your information security. Here are your hosts, FRSecure's Evan Francine and Brad Nye.
Welcome back. Unless you're lost, you know that this is the UNSECURITY podcast. This is episode 56, and I'm Evan Francine, your host. The date is December 2nd, and joining me is my buddy. I'm calling you my buddy, Brad.
I'll take it.
You'll take it?
I'll take it.
Sweet. We're buddies. How was your Thanksgiving holiday?
Good. It was long.
Long? What was about as long as every other one, right?
Well, yeah, when you have a bunch of family around, it seems like and then like bad weather where you can't get out and do stuff. It gets long.
I had to shovel my roof twice.
Oof.
Yeah, I know. Well, my house was built in 1872, so I have the insulation isn't quite as good as normal houses. So you get those big icicles that hang down. But anyway,
that's no fun.
Yeah.
How was your Thanksgiving?
Oh.
Other than shoveling your roof?
Shoveled my roof. I went out shopping and
yeah, I saw the pictures.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Where'd you see those?
My wife showed me. I guess.
Was it on Facebook?
Yeah.
Gosh, man, people cannot stay off of Facebook.
I know.
I didn't post those.
No,
but
they were good.
A friend of mine did.
I liked your backpack.
Yeah, that little backpack. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, that's what I do when I go shopping.
Yeah.
I just mess around. Yeah. I didn't buy.
You got to do something to entertain yourself.
Yeah, I didn't buy anything. I don't. I'm not good at buying stuff. All right. Well, we have another awesome show planned today. A couple of weeks ago, I read a news story about the Target. The Target breach just kind of lives on, right? It happened in 2013. Here we are 6 years later, and it's almost to the day 6 years later. We're still talking about Target and the Target breach. This time, the news story is Target is suing Chubb, their insurance provider. Actually, it was Ace was the original insurance provider. Chubb purchased Ace not that long ago, and so now it's Chubb's problem. But it's about claims related to the Target breach of 2013. 6 years later, the fallout continues. Now, people who know my past know I spent a long time, almost 2 years, as a consultant to the Special Litigation Committee, which, for people who don't know what that is, essentially Target sued Target, right? The shareholders filed suit against the board of directors. When that happens, it's called the derivative action, or so I'm told. I'm not a lawyer. And the Special Litigation Committee is assembled, and its job is, I think, to investigate the charges and then consult the judge or the court on whether or not to proceed. So in all of that, my job was to consult the Special Litigation Committee, a bunch of lawyers, which was fun. I think lawyers are different breed than me, but some will say the same thing about security people. Yeah. But anyway, I mentioned that because the Target breach, I know many things. I know the inside stuff, but I'm still, obviously under confidentiality, so I can't say, too much, but, we can certainly keep it to what's public. So when I read the news, though, about this lawsuit, I figured I'd reach out because it's an insurance thing. That I'd reach out to, my favorite cyber insurance guy, David Cruz, to get his take. And then David, who, long story short, just had a baby. So congratulations to David. I hope you're listening and enjoying not your sleep, but enjoying the baby. But he introduced me to this cool guy, this cool cat called, his name is Justin Webb. He's an information security guy and an attorney, a privacy attorney with Godfrey & Kahn, a leading law firm out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So welcome, Justin.
Hey, guys. Glad to be here. You mentioned earlier that, information security people are a special breed and lawyers are a special breed, and I'm both of them. So that makes me, I guess, extra special or extra weird, probably a little bit of both.
Yeah, definitely a unicorn.
Yeah.
And I was looking at your past. I mean, you've got a pretty good background. I think you Marquette University. Are you still at Marquette University? No, or yes?
No, I'm at Godfrey & Kahn now, but I was the information security officer and a security analyst there for about 4.5, 5 years. And at that time, there was only one person in that role, so I was sort of doing cybersecurity for the university by myself. Mm-hmm. And then I was also going to law school at the same time. So when I finished, then I went to work for a federal judge for about a year, and then I started practicing law. And I've been doing sort of cybersecurity, data privacy law for about 5 years now. So it's been really fun, and it's super helpful to have like a technical background when you're doing, we handle data breaches and cybersecurity related things. So it's really good to have that technical background. There are other attorneys out there that have that background, but they're pretty rare. So it gives me a sort of a unique perspective.
Including the attorney, I know I read a little bit, and we'll get to this in a little bit too. Briggs and Morgan, I think, is involved in maybe they're representing Target in this lawsuit. Because I know Briggs and Morgan, I know Philip Schickenberg. I can't remember. I can never say his last name right. But I think he came about it the other way. And I'm speaking based on what I remember about him. A lawyer who then got into cybersecurity, whereas you kind of came at it from, you were an information security person at the same time and then became a lawyer, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I think a lot of attorneys come in the other direction, because they may go straight through law school, but have an interest in it. And then you're sort of, learning the technical stuff, while you're practicing law. And that can be pretty challenging. So I'm always impressed when there are sort of super smart attorneys who know, the technical stuff and the legal stuff. Cause it's a lot to fill your brain. I forget a lot of things because I feel like my brain is full. So
yeah, I've definitely worked with some attorneys that for like, okay, whatever. They clearly have no idea.
Well, and it's funny, when I was on the special litigation committee, or the consultant to the special litigation committee, central to the case with Target was network segmentation and versus isolation. And, how the attacker was able to pivot from the corporate network into the cardholder data environment. And I was talking to, speaking to attorneys there that didn't even know what a network was.
The eyes glazed over.
Oh my gosh. And it was like, okay, whiteboard. And it took, I don't know, probably a week of daily sessions trying to get them just to understand what TCP/IP is.
And these are not dumb people. These are like super smart people that it's not how their brain works.
Right.
Yeah. Wow.
I also learned from my time there, because I think that was the first time I spent hours and hours and hours with attorneys working on a breach, that they have a different sense of humor than security people.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, because I would tell a joke and thinking that this is the funniest thing ever, because I want to fit in with these guys, and they look at me like I'm from Mars. Then they would say a joke, and I'd be like, I don't get it. And they're rolling. It's like, whatever. So,
I mean, I think I'm a big fan of lawyer jokes. I feel like if you can't laugh at yourself, that you're doing something wrong. Maybe I have that like mixed sense of humor, but I think that's hilarious because that sounds about right also for
totally
interactions.
Yeah. Well, and you get it both ways, right? Because you are, you are a security guy and you are a lawyer. So you probably get both senses of humor. Maybe you could be that translator.
Yeah, maybe. I also get people who just ask me to help them with, general computer things. So, clients pay us a decent amount of money per hour, and sometimes I'm spending it troubleshooting somebody's iPhone. So, you never get out of the IT support realm. I'm sure that happens to you guys too.
Oh yeah, yeah. I still have my mother-in-law asking me to fix her Windows XP.
XP.
I know. I'm like, lady, please, not lady. I do kind of say it like that, but it's time to upgrade, but I don't want to upgrade. No, you really need to upgrade. Yeah. And at that point, it's a whole new system.
Right.
I mean, we can't. Anyway.
It's a lot of training.
Yeah. Whole nother story. So you're at Godfrey and Kahn. Can you tell, for people who don't know what you do, tell us a little bit about what you do there.
Sure. So Godfrey & Kahn's a law firm of about 180 attorneys, and it's sort of like a full-service law firm. So we have corporate, litigation, healthcare. We do some work in startups. We sort of have the full slate. We have an insurance practice. So we have attorneys in all different areas, and I co-lead the data privacy and cybersecurity practice group, and I'm also a member of the sort of larger technology and digital business group. And so my practice is a mix of data breach response, so helping clients when a data breach occurs, also helping companies with their cybersecurity programs, so written information security policies and incident response plans, and doing tabletop exercises to prepare clients for a breach. And then there's the data privacy side. So I've been spending an inordinate amount of time with clients on the California Consumer Privacy Act, which goes into effect on January 1st. And then GDPR, which is the European data privacy regulation. We've worked with a number of clients on that. And then just sort of like general, I guess I could say like regular privacy laws in the United States. And then our firm also does some, a lot of mergers and acquisitions. So companies purchasing other companies. And so a lot of the work I do there is just data privacy and cybersecurity due diligence. So let's get under the hood of a company, see what they're doing on cybersecurity, see what they're doing on data privacy, and sort of get a sense of how much risk there is. Are they using multi-factor authentication? Have they been doing like penetration testing? Going through all of the normal things you would do if you were an outside cybersecurity consultant, on the one hand, and then sort of framing that within the larger sort of legal compliance obligations. Because there have been a number of purchases of companies, Marriott, Yahoo, where there was either a latent breach going on during the purchase process or something discovered post purchase, which can have a big effect on the valuation of a company and can cause lots of headaches afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. So that brings up a really good question, or a question. I don't know if it's a good question, but how do you protect yourself against purchasing a breach? Can you write that into the contract or something so that
that's good.
If I'm looking to acquire another company and I want to protect myself against, maybe a breach that I don't know about, can you write that into the contract and sort of protect yourself legally that way?
Yeah, I mean, you typically will put what's called like a representation of warranty in the purchase agreement that says, the company represents and warrants that the seller of the company represents and warrants that they have not experienced any like material security incident or data breach, etc. Sometimes that's knowledge qualified, which means that they're saying like to their knowledge, there's not a breach. But typically, I mean, we don't write a purchase agreement or negotiate one that doesn't have that rep in it. Unless there's some extenuating circumstances, or we can't get somebody to agree to that. But yeah, that would be the typical way that you would address it. And you can get further under the hood if you want, so if you're buying a Yahoo or a Marriott, you might bring in an outside cybersecurity consultant to do an actual vulnerability analysis, penetration testing, potential historical breach analysis if you're really worried about it. But that typically doesn't happen a lot in sort of run-of-the-mill middle market deals.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised in how many middle market deals they don't do enough information security due diligence. Do you see that too?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the level of sophistication of the attorneys and the parties. We do a pretty comprehensive job on that, and I think it's absolutely critical as companies have, more and more information. And, and it doesn't have to be just protecting personal information, right? It could be, if you're Coke, protecting the formula to Coke, or, other intellectual property, trade secrets, etc. And so, I think the game is being raised and people are more in tune to it. But I think if you looked at things maybe 5 or 10 years ago, there wasn't a lot of energy spent here. Now in deals, this is probably the area that gets the most sort of negotiation over the reps related to this, because a lot of it too is sort of unknowns. When you're making a rep that there hasn't been any data breach, you have sometimes limited information. And there could be, like some sophisticated nation state attacker in your network that nobody would have been able to discover. Mm-hmm. And so, there are certain scenarios in which it's probably unrealistic to be able to say that, for sure that hasn't occurred. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting area that's definitely getting a lot more attention. And I think incidents that have occurred where companies have been purchased and there have been data breaches that were ongoing have sort of raised the hackles of, attorneys in this area, and they're spending more time trying to get under the hood a little further. But there's no silver bullet, obviously.
I know we've got a couple of companies that are focused on, merger acquisition for growth that have put together and are using our vendor risk management platform. Mm-hmm. And they'll send them, basically treat them as a high risk vendor and just go from there and take that as at least a starting point. Mm-hmm. So we are seeing some that are doing it, but yeah, I agree. It's a little surprising you don't get more, under the hood, right? It's not cheap to have buy a breach.
And it could be a tangled web too, right? Because if I'm acquiring another company, and let's say that I didn't do my proper mm-hmm. due diligence in the acquisition before I purchased, and then, a breach is there or something that I should have sort of known about. Mm-hmm. Now I assume that you could make a case that there's some liability on my part.
Yeah.
Because I didn't do that due diligence. So maybe my shareholders, my stakeholders could file suit against me potentially. Is that a thing, Justin, or am I making something up?
I think that's a potential valid claim. It would be sort of like a lack of oversight. And I think, you can pretty much get sued by shareholders for anything.
True.
And so I think that, that's certainly possible. And I think, part of protecting against the risk is to do some extensive due diligence. And I think, the more sophisticated deals with private equity who are buying sort of like technology companies, they get pretty far into the weeds. They'll, if you're buying a company that has code, they'll do, open source software scans and do static code analysis to, determine if there's any flaws in the code. Mm-hmm. They will have, outside IT consultants come in and look at, all kinds of systems and, look at, the underlying code as well, or at least run it through a third party who can do that. So, there is more sophisticated stuff, but absolutely you could have some, a group of shareholders get a bee in their bonnet, and maybe rightfully so if you didn't do the right due diligence in the deal and it caused either an entity ending or significant, cost problem or expenses. Even more so if you didn't have the right reps and warranties in the deal that would allow you to potentially recover for, somebody telling you that there was no breach when there actually was, or they should have known.
Yeah, I'm surprised, because we have maybe 800 active clients today here at FRSecure, and maybe 1,500 that we've worked with, or 1,200 or so.
Yeah.
So we come across a lot of, or many mergers and acquisitions, and I'm surprised at how often security due diligence isn't actually done.
It's financial due diligence is always looked at, right? Are the books good? But very rare to see. Although we did have somebody ask if we could do with our new IR stuff, we're doing threat hunting. Mm-hmm. They said, could you come in and do threat hunting if we were going to purchase someone, rather than doing a risk assessment, do
Right.
look for those signs of the breach. I'm like, yeah.
Right.
Great.
I mean, the other thing that we see, or at least that I typically advocate for, is, there are lots of services that sort of like cull publicly available data, so like compromised email accounts of a business and, email server settings, like DKIM and DMARC and stuff like that, to sort of get an outside sense for what a company's cybersecurity posture is. And so those would seem to be, in some respects, an easy way to get an outside perspective on a company. So, like a security scorecard or something like that. And so that's another way you can at least see what the external world sees about the company, when you're potentially purchasing them, and make some kind of analysis based on that. It doesn't tell you what's under the hood, but it does tell you what other people think about it. And if they have like tons of compromised credentials, you might want to get a little more worried, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think, the thing I have, you mentioned security scorecard. The issue I have with that is when people think that that's comprehensive. You know what I mean? When the riskiest part, or the most significant risk is probably people. It's probably something internal anyway. But good point. I mean, you bring up good points about due diligence is important, I think, it is. Mergers.
I almost wonder at what point not doing it, kind of like with HIPAA, right? It's no longer defensible to say, I didn't know. You have to do the risk assessments. I wonder how long it's going to take before that becomes the norm. Yeah.
Well, it's more so today than it was.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're getting close to that point. Especially in any company that's got personal information. You're pretty much playing with fire when you're not doing that kind of due diligence. Mostly because there's just so much, especially after CCPA goes into effect on January 1st. There's just a lot more privacy and cybersecurity due diligence to be had.
For sure. Well, let's move on. Let's talk about Target versus Chubb. I assume, Justin, you know about this case, and you probably dug in a little bit and seen or read some things about it.
That is correct.
What's your take? Because this was a general liability insurance claim. One of the things that was interesting, when I read the actual lawsuit, there's this thing called loss of use of tangible property that is not physically injured that seems to be central to the case that Target's bringing against Chubb. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, and this is an interesting case generally, but you could have the loss of something. So, like, take for example a car, right? You could have the car stolen, or it could be somebody could pour, sugar in the gas tank and it didn't work. So you could have like the loss of a use of property without any tangible injury. The sort of sugar in the gas tank is a bad example, but there are ways in which something can be sort of like disabled or otherwise have an inability to use it without actually damaging the property itself. And so that's what that sort of catch-all is typically meant to cover. And so Target is using that here to say, look, when you have a data breach and there are credit cards that are used and those get compromised as part of the breach, the issuing banks have to reissue the cards, and therefore those previous cards that now the number has been disclosed are no longer usable. And so that's, a loss of use of that piece of property, the card itself. And so, we had to pay for all of these, or we settled litigation and otherwise negotiated settlements with various card brands and others to have these cards reissued to cardholders. And so we think that falls under the scope of our general liability policy and this sort of loss of use provision.
And they're seeking $74 million, I think, in damages.
Correct. Yeah, and I think for cyber liability insurers, the worry is always that the claims fall outside of the what would typically be a cyber liability insurance policy. So typically you have like a general liability policy that's sort of meant for like premises liability and like people getting injured, like actual tangible property. And typically those aren't meant to cover, or insurers typically don't like to cover under those, damage that arises out of a breach. And so there've been some other cases involving general liability policies, and the opinion in the insurance industry is that that's not where those claims are supposed to go. They're supposed to go under a cyber liability policy that covers, first party data breach expenses, like hiring an attorney like me to help you through the data breach, doing a forensic investigation, and sending out notification letters, et cetera, et cetera. And then third party expenses, which are, lawsuits arising from the breach itself. So like I get sued by, people who had fraud on their accounts, and even fines arising under PCI, or lawsuits arising under there. And so I think whenever you see it sort of creep out into a general liability policy, that's when insurers, take a hardline stance. And there isn't a lot of detail. One thing I noticed is there isn't a lot of detail in the lawsuit about sort of the underlying policy, and what it defines as an occurrence. And so it'll be interesting to see, whenever you get a complaint in a lawsuit, you're seeing sort of like one side's take of the case in the light most favorable to that person, and within the facts that they have, or the allegations that they potentially have. And so it'll be interesting to see Ace and Chubb's answer in this, and what the basis is for them denying the indemnity under the policy. Because it sounds like, at least based on reading of the lawsuit, and bearing in mind that I have no involvement in this lawsuit whatsoever, and don't represent either of the parties.
Was that like a legal disclaimer you just did right there?
Yeah. Is that they have been negotiating for a while over this, or at least been in discussions. And it sounds like, Ace/Chubb has said, nope, we're not going to indemnify you for this. They've been talking about it. I'm assuming they probably issued some kind of coverage letter that said, nope, we don't think this is covered under the policy. And so that's why. So Target's filing a lawsuit for two things. The first is breach of contract, which is a breach of the insurance agreement between the parties. And there's actually like multiple policies here. There's an underlying policy, and then an excess policy, and then another policy on top of that. So there's three. And then the other one is something called declaratory relief, which is I go into court and I say, hey, judge, I want you to declare or issue an order that says that Chubb/Ace needs to pay me for this, so that the court will interpret the contract and issue a judgment saying, yep, based on my reading of the contract, they're required to pay you for this. So typically, as the case progresses, the declaratory relief would go away, because the breach of contract claim will potentially resolve the entire thing. But sometimes it stays, and it depends on the court. But they're effectively the same kind of relief, because if you win the contract claim, the court is declaring that you're entitled to be reimbursed under there. So that's sort of how all of that works. But this will be an interesting one, and I think a lot of insurers and insureds will be paying attention to this case.
Yeah, for sure. And now because it's like watching two heavyweights slug it out, right? And is there legal, so whatever happens in this case, will it set legal precedent for other cases in the future?
Yeah. Open the floodgates.
Potentially. I mean, I think one of the things that, every case in the insurance world, has the potential to do that. I think one of the things, one of the reasons why it might not is that each policy is written sort of in its own terms, right? And so it would only set precedent to the extent that you had a similar policy that had similar coverage. And typically, if these kinds of things occur, insurers are pretty quick to make modifications to the common coverage form and common language that they typically use to make sure that, there aren't interpretations of it that are inconsistent with what they intended. So I think, potentially there could be changes, but absolutely every case has the potential to set precedent. And I think you might see what are called amicus briefs, which are sort of like friend of the court briefs. If this were to go up to the appellate level, it's probably going to be a considerable amount of time before the case is resolved, especially if it's appealed. And if you're insurers, you certainly don't want to have negative precedent out there that sort of broadens the scope of the amount of money or reimbursement or indemnification that you're required to do under the policy, especially if that wasn't contemplated as part of the initial underwriting. Like these kinds of expenses. And so, it'll certainly be one to watch. Like I said, I think it'll be interesting once the answer is filed. I'm sure there'll be a motion to dismiss at some point in time. And then, you get a lot more of the factual basis underlying the actual claim itself.
Now, will the response also be publicly available?
Yeah. So the answer, unless it were to be filed under seal, which I can't think of a reason why it would be. Typically, you can't file one under seal. It would be public. So, and I haven't checked the docket yet to see, but I know that lawsuit was filed a few weeks ago, I believe. And so the answer would be due normally it's within 60 days.
Yeah. Yeah. It was filed on the 15th of November. So maybe middle of January, maybe.
Yeah. And you can always file an answer early, or they can file a motion to dismiss as opposed to an answer. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that it could evolve. One of the underlying sort of interesting parts about this lawsuit, or at least this area, is, back in, I think, 2007 or 2008, and then again in 2010, you had states who passed laws that actually allowed financial institutions to recover these exact kind of expenses. So your home state, Minnesota, has a law that says if you have a data breach and it affects financial institutions and they have to reissue cards to cardholders, then those financial institutions can recover the money for that. And so it's not just sort of like this, underlying lawsuit that Target had against cardholders, but there was some basis in law for that. And state legislatures had done that, and it was based on PCI. So there was this codification of PCI, and the state of Washington sort of did the exact same thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I suppose as a guy in your seat, you're probably geeking out about this case, right? I mean, it's going to be pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be certainly one to watch. I think the interesting part will be the fact that it's being brought under the general liability policy and how the arguments are framed around that. Like I said, I think you get insurers who don't want to be using that kind of policy for these kinds of incidents. And a lot of times they'll have provisions in the general liability policy that exclude things that would arise from a data breach. And so, I haven't looked at the underlying policy, so I'm not sure if it has those, but that would typically be the basis for arguing that this doesn't apply, and that they don't have any obligation, or that, sort of the replacement of cards isn't the kind of damage that was contemplated by the provision. The other thing I always think is interesting, and if those laws that I just talked about didn't exist, so like the ones in Minnesota and Washington and other places, is that typically the banks do this kind of reissuing for customers like all the time, and they don't charge customers for it. So like if you call and say, I want a new card, typically you don't get charged for that. And so it's an interesting concept that what they would normally do for customers, they're suing to get recover money for. Now, of course, it does have a cost, but that's a sort of interesting concept altogether, that, for the majority of time, they eat this cost, right? They don't actually pass it on to the customer. But in this scenario, they are.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. You mentioned there are two general liability policies, that target claims covers the loss. And they have policy numbers there, and then they say is attached to Exhibit A. I didn't see Exhibit A. Is that something that we would see or maybe it's somewhere else?
It's probably on the docket. Typically, it's attached to the complaint itself. And I haven't pulled the actual underlying policy, but it's probably publicly posted too.
Okay.
So it's always interesting to me for these things, because I actually had a federal lawsuit that I filed for some stuff early 2000s that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and all the behind the scenes stuff that you just don't ever really think about. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's really crazy to see how much, like, all the the filings and the legalese and the interpretation of it and all the stuff that they argue about. It's interesting.
Well, that's why we pay people like Justin.
Yeah.
To wade.
Yeah. Oh, I was so lost when they were going through that, and it's like, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's all these like procedural rules, and, ways that and terms, and it's just like you have sort of nerd speak and like information security, and you start whipping out acronyms, and people are like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, let me talk about the OSI model first.
Right.
And so, sort of the same thing. And I think that's where, to be honest, it's sometimes a barrier for people who, have legitimate claims, because the system seems like it's extremely complicated, and, you need an attorney to sort of walk you through that, because there are just sort of traps all along the way. And so, yes, you should hire a good attorney to help you if you have a claim that you need to bring, especially in federal court.
Yeah. So on my website, the evanfrancine.com, where I posted the show notes, you can find the link to the actual case, the docket, I guess, on Law 360. It's a good read. It's only 14 pages long. So, and it seems to be written in plain English. I understood most of what I read, which was good. But check it out. Maybe we can learn some things. Now, one of the things, and one of the reasons why I wanted to have David on too, and you'll probably be able to speak to this, Justin, is how could I avoid this if I was target or in my own business? Is it, because I think one of the things that David had given really good advice when he was on the show was get a insurance agent who specializes in cyber insurance. That way you make sure that you're covered from breach-related stuff, and then you've got general liability things and whatever. Do you have a piece of advice for listeners on how they can avoid this same situation?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with David. He's a great resource for me. He's a super smart guy. I think he's awesome at what he does in the insurance area. And finding somebody like that, there are a few other people that we deal with in the Milwaukee market who really know cyber liability insurance. And when they come to you, obviously they have multiple policies that you can choose from, like a smorgasbord of insurance that you can pick from. And, each policy has different language, and the brokers typically, sort of smart brokers who deal in cyber liability insurance know the difference between each one of them, how much they cover, right down to like each individual sort of clause for potential damages. And so it's super important that you have somebody that's advocating for you, that's not just trying to sell you sort of like the policy that will get them the highest commission. And that's, understands each of these insurers and their coverage forms. So I think hiring a super knowledgeable broker is absolutely critical, especially in this area. You don't want somebody who only deals in sort of like CGL, general liability policies to be helping you with something like this, especially if you're a sophisticated business with lots of personal information, because it can be the difference between having a lot of comfort during a data breach and having an absolute nightmare. Right. We represent clients all the time who have sort of very low coverage policies that were bought, years ago and never updated, and nobody ever sort of guided them into what they should have had. And it's sort of an uphill battle all along the way, because, when it's money coming directly out of the business's pocket, that can cause the business to go under. It can cause sort of like all kinds of problems. And so you want to ensure that, pays the claims and assists you along the way and has smart people working in their cyber claims department. And there are very good insurers out there who do all of those things and can really like go to bat for you and protect you. But these kind of claims also are inevitable in a world of data breaches. So you have people who are injured by data breaches, like issuing banks who have to reissue these cards. And they see it as the fault of other people who potentially weren't doing what they were supposed to do with regard to cybersecurity. And so as between the issuing bank and, a target or whoever, they feel like they are entitled to recover the money for, somebody else's bad cybersecurity decision. So it's just as important to have a policy as it is to, not suck at cybersecurity.
See, he used the word suck.
Yeah, I like it.
A lawyer who knows cybersecurity and uses the word suck, my kind of guy.
There you go. It always surprises me, like how little businesses know about their coverage, right? They'll say, "Oh yeah, we've got cyber insurance," and you look at it and it's like a $25,000 rider, and that's it. It's like, well, that's not going to do you any good.
Well, and that's the thing, right? This is not commodity. So take the time to go through your policies. Take the time to find a trusted advisor who will review the policy for you, with you, and make sure you're making the right choice.
Yeah. Is your business worth the time to make sure you understand what you've got?
Well, especially in the mid-market, right? Because most mid-market companies don't recover from a data breach.
Yeah, I think they're looking for to save money on insurance, but this is sort of like not the place to gamble and not the place to skimp. I think it's encouraging that the market has evolved and more companies have it, but we still run into clients who don't have cyber liability coverage. And it's always like, oh man, this is going to be really hard on the company. And you feel, and it's sort of like it's out there, it's being advertised. Of course, insurance agents want to sell it, right? Because it's another policy that they can sell to you, but it has to be a standalone policy. If you just have a rider, it's never going to be good news, and especially if you have a very complicated breach. And so, I can't stress enough how super important it is to have a good cyber liability insurance policy, somebody helping you with it, and reviewing it every year, right? Because there could be some other insurer that has a better deal or better coverage. Maybe they cover more social engineering fraud than another company does, and that they, or they have a sort of history with either paying or not paying claims or whatever. But brokers know all that because they're sort of like dealing with people in that industry and talking with the underlying insurers all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, good stuff. I'm thinking we have I have two other things to talk to you about, Justin. One is CCPA and the other is China's cryptography law. We're at about almost 45 minutes. I'm wondering if you will have time, if you could have time next Monday to come and talk to us about CCPA.
Absolutely.
All right. So you're going to be the first guest that's on 2 consecutive podcasts.
Ooh. I feel very excited about that.
All right, so we're going to defer.
Honored, actually.
Yeah. Well, and we're honored too.
Yeah,
the advice you've given so far is awesome.
Agreed.
Yeah. Thanks.
So we'll talk CCPA next week, and nothing like last minute. Everybody's last minute anyway. So you have till January 1, 2020. If you haven't already been down that path for CCPA, then Oh gosh, get going.
We
You
had-
actually should have started a year ago, because I think we'll talk about it later. But
Yeah.
you have 12 months worth of.
If we had somebody
stuff.
in November come and say, "Hey, so do you guys know anything about this CCPA and what we're supposed to be doing?" It's like, oh, that's gonna be a bad day for you.
It is.
we get that all the time. So, and I'm still getting those calls.
Yeah.
So, which then you sort of like take on the worry for the client. You know, you're like, oh God, they only got a month, and what are we gonna do? But it's a big deal. I'm looking forward to talking about it. I think I know a lot about it, so
Cool.
it'd be good times.
Cool. All right. We'll talk about that next week. Let's talk about China's cryptography law.
Yeah.
I had one of the listeners of the podcast that emailed, our show, and had asked, "Are you going to talk about this law?" I'm like, "Well, I guess." So I figured let's add it. It shouldn't be a super long discussion, but I wanted to get your take. I included a link too in our show notes, Justin. It comes from Gatestone Institute, International Policy Council, and the title of the article is "China Adopts Malicious Cybersecurity Rules." Now you've reviewed it. What's your take on what the article says?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can tell you, sort of like taking just a step back real quick, that a lot of companies, as a matter of fact, I think in the past, month or so, I've gotten maybe three calls on the new Chinese cybersecurity law, and it's not really new. It came out in like 2017, and they've been putting out all these regulations since then and implementations, and they have sort of like a personal information law as well, or regulation. I can't remember which is which. But they sort of hew to what you would expect from China. They have a extremely large surveillance state.
Mm-hmm.
They want to see the internet traffic that's going through the country, and especially outside. And a lot of the laws are tailored to the idea that, like, even security breaches and other information or other situations that occur in China could potentially have an impact on national security. And that's sort of the impetus of the encryption laws, and sort of like everything else that they're doing is that they're trying to protect state secrets. They're trying to prevent people from being able to encrypt traffic that could potentially not be viewable by the Chinese government. And so all of these laws are sort of meant to codify their right to sort of snoop on traffic, generally be weary of any sort of foreign encryption. So, the law potentially requires you to like register with China if you're using foreign encryption, or it has to be approved. And so, I think there's a lot of worry there that, there's already sort of a lot of theft of trade secrets that occurs via either people acting on behalf of China or China itself.
Right.
And so I think, there's just a ton of worry that this is just another sort of way to peel back the hood, look underneath. And so a lot of companies are debating whether or not it's worth it to have operations in China if these kinds of laws are going to be what they pass. And that's actually been the framing of the question from some of my clients is it even worth it to do this if they're going to be able to look at all the traffic, and what does that mean for our IP, for personal information, et cetera?
Well, Steve Dickinson, I thought there's an interesting quote in the article. Steve Dickinson, for the China Law blog, writes, once data crosses the Chinese border on a network, 100% of that data will be 100% available to the Chinese government and the CCCP or CCP.
Yeah. And then they're going to share the seized information with state enterprises. So, like you said, they're just basically legalizing the theft.
Well, and as a U.S. company doing business in China, is there any protection whatsoever?
I mean, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I mean, you're going up against the, Chinese government. And the other thing is that you certainly don't want to be violating these laws, right? Because the penalties could cause even bigger harm to the operations. It's not exactly clear what the penalties are under the law, or at least I'm not aware of what they are. But you certainly don't want to raise the ire of the Chinese government. And they make some distinctions in the encryption law between sort of like common encryption versus other types of encryption. But what they're really focused on is like foreign, so like US based encryption that could potentially prevent them from looking at the network traffic. And so, the other concern is if you're disclosing all of this stuff, or it's being sort of sniffed, or, they're doing packet inspection or deep packet inspection of what you're transmitting, are you losing the value of that IP, of your potential trade secrets, and what kind of effect could that have on, a company who has super secret stuff, and some of that gets transferred over, point-to-point networks that go to China or whatever. Right. And so I think that there's just a lot of fear. The other thing is that this is so, in some ways antithetical to U.S. law. It's sort of like, in some respects, like the exact opposite, although let's set aside sort of like the NSA and other sort of things that have gone on. But
it's certainly not compatible.
Yeah, I was going to say,
how do we do business?
And how does if you comply with that law, if it conflicts with your GDPR or some other U.S. laws, how do you reconcile those?
Well,
yeah,
if I can decrypt and just one more thing too, if I can decrypt the data,
right?
What's to save me from changing it? So data integrity is now called into question, right. And then data can be used against me.
Yeah, that and if you're transmitting, I think the GDPR is a great point, right? So if you are somebody else is viewing the information, then you haven't secured personal information, right? That's an unauthorized disclosure of the information to a third party. They would technically be a processor under GDPR, which would actually give rise to certain obligations on the Chinese government. And then you get into this whole, like, we're into like sort of crazy land, right? Where none of this even makes sense. And so
that's where I live.
One way to address it would be that what you do in China is a very limited set of things, and so you shift some of those operations outside of China. But for some companies, that's just not possible. They have huge sort of business arms doing business in China. If you're a company that makes proprietary items in China that you sell in the United States, you have to be worried about, the underlying IP potentially being compromised. And you just don't know, is this a legitimate, concern of the Chinese government that, traffic could be hidden from them and that could affect national security? Or is it a backdoor way to get insight into additional traffic and sort of proprietary information for nefarious purposes? And to be honest, I don't think the Chinese government has the greatest track record on that front. And so, I think that's where a lot of the worry arises from.
Yeah.
Well, and given this with, kind of all the tariff stuff going on, and this macroeconomic thing, it's going
to be messy.
And we are in the United States is China's biggest customer. So the fact that, if I was a U.S. company, I don't do business in China. I can't see myself taking that risk.
Yeah.
Unless, like you said, Justin, I could figure out some way to make it really, really limited where I don't care if this data is exposed. But, what kind of data is that?
That and the other sort of challenge of the Chinese cybersecurity law more generally. So you've got this encryption portion of it, but then it's got all these other portions. They sort of define entities as like a network operator. And if you're a network operator, then you have these other obligations that you're required to do. So the other thing about it is that it's sort of like extremely confusing to United States entities, and you need sophisticated Chinese counsel to assist you with determining what your obligations would be under the law. And so for a lot of companies, they see a lot of these stories and they, don't have sophisticated Chinese counsel that can potentially help them work through it. And so it looks even more amorphous, and it just has sort of let's set aside everything, it just looks ominous, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it looks scary. And that might be enough for the board of a company to say, look, how much of our operations and revenue comes out of China? Is that something we could shift elsewhere, and maybe, have some hit to our bottom line? But I think a lot of companies are probably going to be thinking about that because these laws continue to be more restrictive, more, some people would characterize it as oppressive. It's certainly oppressive to privacy and security of information. Certainly decrypting information certainly doesn't make it more secure, right? And so I think there's both a cybersecurity and a privacy concern.
Wow. And I don't know what recourse you would have. I mean, you're file suit in the Chinese court, and
right.
what's that going to go like?
You pretty much
I mean, that wouldn't be the place I'd be hanging my hat on for sure.
Wow.
Well, good stuff. We have, like I said, we're going to have you back next week, so I'm excited about that. We can talk about CCPA. If there is any update to the target breach, we can talk about that too. I wanted to get to just real quick. We have a new show format. We mentioned it last week, and we already got an email or two to unsecurity@protonmail.com. That's our email address. And what we're doing is just taking 10 minutes of each show to talk to somebody who's looking for a job in information security. Give them 10 minutes, talk to them, whatever. I mean, it's really an open forum, something to hopefully get them some exposure and maybe land either their first job or the next job. Again, that email is unsecurity@protonmail.com. We're going to do that starting after the first of the year. So we have about another month left. I'm just kind of letting people know. Because if you're not looking, if you're looking for a job now, I'm hoping you find it already before that January thing comes. All right, we have some news. 3 things I have in news, and they're all pretty much related. The first one is don't buy anyone a Ring camera.
Yeah.
This is from Gizmodo. It's I think more of an opinion piece by Adam Clark Estes. And he writes on Gizmodo, don't buy anyone a Ring camera. And he's got 2 central reasons for that. The first is a technical one. If you use the Ring app, which you really don't have an option not to use if you're using the Ring hardware, you automatically get enrolled in this thing called Neighbors, and there's no way for you to opt out. Mm-hmm. And Neighbors is a crime-fighting feed thing. It's an invention from Ring and law enforcement. The second thing is when you enroll in Neighbors, your videos or data could be shared with law enforcement when they request it. But there's kind of this secret network of law enforcement agencies with Ring, and it's not really clear. So anyway, the advice is not to use Ring. And we've got a legal guy on. So what did you think of this article, Justin?
I mean, I had seen the letter from the senators about it. I mean, I think, look, as a user of devices and other things, I think you want to know what those companies are doing with your information. It's never a good idea, I think, to auto-enroll people in features that potentially could be sharing their information with third parties. I mean, I don't know exactly what sort of Ring's practices are per se. I know what I've read on it. I think it's extremely troubling when on the other side, just to sort of play devil's advocate, I'm sure law enforcement gets a lot of useful information from Ring cameras, but that's not really why people buy them, right? They buy them for their own sort of security. And I think I would be a little bit weirded out if, law enforcement could log into a portal and see what's going on my front porch. I mean, it would be extremely boring, but, maybe sometime you catch something interesting, and maybe some people would be okay with that. But I think the larger point is that in this day and age, users and consumers want the right to make those kinds of choices.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's not exigent circumstances or, somebody's got a warrant to look at that, then they don't want that to happen. even if it is in your privacy policy, you should probably still, call users' attention to it a little bit more. It shouldn't come out in sort of like these kinds of news articles. It's just bad sort of press.
Yeah, I can't imagine any way this would be abused.
Yeah, right. I mean, the other thing is, like, how do you know that the people who are accessing it, like, obviously it's being provided to law enforcement, but then you've got the whole, like, is this thing secured? I mean, can you imagine how excited a hacker would be to get access to this portal? That you could look at Ring cameras all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's just, user level privacy choices need to be, I think this reminds me of, if you recall, there were the genealogy sites that were having sort of criminal information submitted to them to try and find familial matches to like killers, etc. And those sites got in trouble for allowing or knowingly allowing law enforcement to sort of do that. And then they started giving users the right to opt out of that. And we can debate whether or not that should be an opt-in versus an opt-out, but at least they were giving users choices to do that. And I think it's pretty similar, right? You're allowing law enforcement to sort of get access to these things and view the information. And some people really care about privacy and don't want that, or maybe they have a negative opinion of police or whatever.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I'm sure there's going to be some sort of challenge in court around this, because it almost seems like what amendment is it? The Second Amendment violation, where unlawful search and seizure, is that the right one?
Fourth Amendment.
I see. Thank God we got lawyers.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the other thing is that if you're representing a company, it's never good news when senators write you a letter, just as a general matter, or write a letter to anybody and publicize it. So it's certainly, to the extent that people are paying attention to this kind of stuff, it's not a good look for them. And it could give rise to an action by the FTC for an unfair deceptive trade practice. That's typically where you would see this kind of enforcement, what road it might head down. The wrinkle here is that, it's not that they're like providing your Ring camera to insurers who are then using that to determine, what rate to charge you for insurance. It's, they're providing it to law enforcement for purportedly legitimate law enforcement purposes. And so you get a little bit more of an argument that like there's some good to be had out of that, which complicates things a little bit. But I think the privacy sort of complaint remains.
Well, and then the whole thing with giving users a discount for reporting quote unquote suspicious people to police from their Ring camera.
And that leads into another news story, right? The next news story is from Threat Post, where Amazon plans to Ring facial recognition based watch list. And so here we're going to add AI into the mix, and where people report suspicious people, right?
Yeah. I mean,
this is getting weird.
Well, and you're outsourcing to people with biases, and how do you know what the validity of define suspicious? I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, I don't even know where to start with that. I think there are significant concerns on the privacy front regarding AI and, implicit bias. And I think, I think there's a lot of sort of heartburn among consumers about a lot of the potential uses of AI and the potential misuse of AI. So I think you've seen with a lot of the companies who have either dropped law enforcement involvement with their AI products, or in the case of Amazon, I believe, have continued to sort of have interactions with law enforcement on the AI front. I think we're just going to see this more, and there is going to need to be more of an outcry or more of a sort of consumer involvement in this issue for it really to take hold. But these kinds of things, I mean, it makes me glad I don't have a Ring camera, to be honest with you. So,
yeah.
Well, and that's the point. And you bring up I think it's going to have to come from consumers, right? It's going to have to hurt sales before something's going to happen here. So spread the word, right? I mean, make sure that people understand that when you go over to your neighbor's house and he's got a Ring camera, I mean, have the discussion or something. Mm-hmm. Don't just let people live in ignorance thinking that
there's other options
fine.
that are.
So ignorance kills.
Totally.
That, and if you're walking over there and they have a Ring camera and this AI sort of is on, then your biometric information is being collected, right? And are you okay with that? I mean, just as a general matter, if you have somebody who has a Ring camera at their house, if you're a sort of super privacy guy, then you're probably not a big fan of that generally, because you've got your image being captured and sent to a third party and then shipped back down to your friend's camera. I don't want to get into sort of like the tinfoil hat sort of land, but
it could get crazy.
Those things are concerning for people. Granted, when you walk around in a city anywhere, you're being recorded effectively almost all the time, especially if you're in like New York City. Mm-hmm. But you always do have a choice about, at least in some respects, how much privacy you want to, how much of your sort of privacy you want to give away versus keep. And how you control that.
Yeah. So Black Friday's already gone. Today is Cyber Monday. So if you're out shopping for a ring, just understand the risks. I can't tell you what to buy and what not to buy, but there are some privacy issues for sure.
Yeah.
All right. The last news is just quick. It's just a reminder, really, from this is from SC Magazine. It's the title is Black Friday. Cyber Monday scams are on the loose. Businesses need to prepare. This is an annual thing. Just diligence, right? It's an awareness. According to a study in this article from ZeroFox's Alpha team, they've already identified 61,305 potential scams spread across 26 brands. Brick-and-mortar retailers are the primary focus, with 92% of the campaigns spotted using a store brand in some manner. So, keep an eye out. Anyway, we're not going to go too deep into that one. I think that's about it. This is episode 56 is kind of a wrap. We've still got a spillover into episode 57. If you like kind of listening to this discussion about legal stuff, we're going to talk about CCPA in episode 57. I'll get the show notes out relatively quickly. Thank you, Justin, for joining us and sharing your perspective.
Yeah, it's been great.
And thank you to our listeners. Keep the questions and feedback coming. We're still a little behind in responding. I think there's probably 5 or 6 emails in there that we haven't responded to, but we'll get to it. We love your feedback. Send things to us by email at unsecurity@protonmail.com. If you like socializing on the interwebs, you can find me on Twitter at Evan Francine. You can find Brad at Brad Nye. Justin, do you have a social way that you want people to get in touch with you or interact?
I am on LinkedIn, so just search for my name and connect with me on there.
Excellent. So it's Justin Webb, W-E-B-B. All right, that's it. We'll talk to you next week, Justin.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the UNSECURITY podcast. We value our listeners and would love to hear from you. Give us your feedback by emailing us at unsecurity@protonmail.com. That's unsecurity@protonmail.com. Be sure to tune in next week to hear the latest insights from Brad and Evan.